longer be in slavery to sin. If then we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. Do you ever think to yourself on any given day, the world has gone insane? It's madness. Well, you're not alone. I think we priests talk about it pretty frequently. 2017, there was a plethora of books written on a Christian response to what's going on in the world, what we should do, what our strategy should be. Now, the next few minutes might feel like a rapid-fire book review. Please bear with me. I think it's helpful to drop book titles that are worthy of your time, and so I'll do so tonight. But all of these books, all three of them have been published within the last year, each have pretty solid points. They have their similarities, but they have their distinct differences in their approach or their response. The most famous, or the most widely commented upon, was the book called The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher. So Rod Dreher, a prolific writer on the interwebs, and formerly Catholic but Orthodox now. When I saw that book title, I was immediately drawn to it because I thought Benedict Option, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, big fan. Let me see what Benedict XVI has going on. But it's not about him at all, even though Rod Dreher has appreciation for the Pope Emeritus. Rod Dreher actually gets inspiration from a book that I gained inspiration from. Last night I shared with you a foundational book in my high school experience, a book called A Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. Tonight I speak of the book that kind of changed my worldview in college. It's a lot more heady. I wouldn't suggest it for anybody that's not used to reading philosophy, but if you're up for the challenge, go for it. It's a book called After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, a philosopher that's now at Notre Dame, a retired professor. There are some that say that book is probably the most influential book of philosophy of the last 100 years. He takes a look at the modern world and all of the moral discussions we're having, if you want to call them discussions, and he says, really, they're not going anywhere. Why is that? Why can we not seem to get to any sort of agreement on any sort of topic of any moral weight, and that's extremely frustrating. And he says we can look back to the Enlightenment period and how it began to question even the very purpose of human existence. Once we can't figure out the end goal, then the means by which we choose it doesn't make any sense. It's each man for himself. And the result, as we have experienced it, is a subjective approach to moralism, where we kind of pick for ourselves, relativism, emotivism, where we make our moral choices based on our emotions. So in that sense, it's really impossible to come to any sort of conclusion. He says, really, when moral philosophy was flourishing, it was in the time of Aristotle, and when we held to Aristotle, because he was clear in knowing that the human person flourishes when the human person is virtuous. Virtue propels the man to his excellence. And notice, we don't ever hear the term virtue anymore. That's just maybe values. Everybody has values, but we don't hear about virtues. It's because no one can agree about what the excellent man is. And so his remedy, Alistair MacIntyre's, is we need to regain a sense of telos, a Greek term meaning purpose or end. Once we reclaim that, then we can all work towards it. And he gives a pretty bleak picture and says, really, we're in a tough time. And he concludes his book very, very interestingly and almost mysteriously. It's not a spoiler. It's okay. It's a philosophy book. It's not like a book, it's like a movie. He says, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing some time. We are waiting for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. And that's how he concludes his book. He says the barbarians are not outside ready to pounce on us. They've been ruling us. Now we need a Saint Benedict, a very different one, but a new one. So I was inspired to look up what's the big deal about Saint Benedict. This 6th century saint, as a young man, goes to Rome hoping to find an education there. And what he finds is a bunch of barbarians. This is the end of the Roman Empire, and the place is about to fall apart. And he recognizes it. There's nothing good. It's mere debauchery here. And so in the end, he flees Rome, lives as a hermit for a few years, and lives this life of prayer and work, ora et labora. And other men of like mind, seeing what he sees, join him in a community. And those communities form the new notion of monasticism. These monasteries, living in this rhythm of prayer and work, actually preserve culture and preserve faith. They maintain the classic literature, the music, the chant. They preserve beauty, and they preserve faith and rationality. And so, when Rome is crumbling around them, there they are unscathed, ready to bring that culture to the world. Many historians say St. Benedict of Norcia saved Western civilization as we know it. A bold claim, but probably true. Rod Dreher, who read After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, is inspired and says there are a lot of parallels to the Roman days of the 6th century in our day today. The barbarians are not out on the frontiers ready to pounce. They've been ruling us, and we might as well see ourselves as one of them. His solution, or his proposal in his book, The Benedict Option, is that we take that option, that we kind of flee the madness, that we go off maybe to a different frontier, to establish authentic community, to shelter ourselves a bit from the craziness, so that we might not be influenced by it, that we can regain a sense of beauty and culture and literature and faith and a proper sense of work. And there are some communities out there that have done so. There was actually a full-page feature in the Wall Street Journal last year on Cool Creek Abbey in Wyoming, who have drawn people towards their Carmelite monastery to live in this isolated community to rebuild culture amidst themselves. That's one of the books that came out last year. It was much talked about and much criticized. Another book which I deeply appreciated was Anthony Esselin's book, Out of the Ashes. Anthony Esselin, a formerly Providence College professor who was ostracized from his college, now lives in New Hampshire. He sees a similar thing Rod Dreher does. He says it's pretty bleak out there. So chapter by chapter, he builds on each topic of what needs to be rebuilt. He begins with the idea of truth. Let's start there. Let's reestablish there is objective truth. He goes on to beauty. Let's get rid of our modern concept of modern art and let's say what is beautiful. Is it subjective or is it objective? He goes to modern education, and then he goes to secondary education. He goes to college education. He says there needs to be restoration of masculinity. He agrees with Rod Dreher. The world is not Christian anymore, let alone the Western world. It's not even sanely pagan. It's gone mad. And so we need to rebuild from the ground up. A third book, written last year by a churchman, Archbishop Charles Chaput from Philadelphia. He wrote a book called Strangers in a Strange Land, a quote from Deuteronomy. And he has that sentiment that I began with tonight. Doesn't it seem like the world's gone mad? Do you feel like you're not at home here? Do you feel strange in a very strange land where you're not even speaking a similar moral language of the people next door? He says, first of all, that's normal. That's us. We're Christian. We're different. We're not made for this world. He says, there's no time for despair as Christians. We can look around us and see it's pretty bleak out there, throw our hands up and say, well, it's all finished. It's all over. He said, Christians don't have that privilege of despair. We have no time for it. He also says we have no time for optimism. That might surprise a few of us. He defines, he quotes someone else, but he says optimism is whistling as you walk past the graveyard. It's not real. It's ignoring reality. He doesn't propose that either. He wants realism. He says hope. There's good foundation for Christian hope. Hope is despair overcome, according to George Bernanos, the author. He says we have good reason for hope because Christ has conquered the world. But we don't have the luxury of fleeing from this crazed world either. And that's where, in an indirect way, he begins to critique this idea of the Benedict Option. He quotes the British author G.K. Chesterton. He says, Chesterton says that my country, right or wrong, there's a pride there, a patriotism. He says that makes as much sense as my mother, drunk or sober. A good man will hate the drunkenness, but he will never stop loving his mother. And that's the way we look not only at our nation as Catholic citizens of the United States, but also as citizens of this planet. God has put us here. And after Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead, he looked at his 11 apostles in that upper room and said, "Go make of all nations disciples, teaching them all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." All three of those authors, Dreyer, Esselin, and Chaput, in this past year have offered different ideas of how to respond to a broken world. Each one of them have different plans on how to not only run away from it, but how to affect it, how to change the world. And while they have their differences, and I have more agreements with some than others, I do see that all of them have the commonality that we can't change a world if we're like it. If there is no difference, good luck trying to change it. We can't minister to the world if we're not sharply distinct from it. That's a challenge. To be in the world but not of it sounds great, but it's hard. The past couple of nights we've talked about our main enemies in the spiritual battle. The battle for our souls. The first night we discussed Satan, our primary adversary. Last night we talked about the flesh and how it's wounded. Our desires are errant. They're disobedient. Some of them even turn evil. How do we corral them? Well, while prayer is our first defense against that battle of Satan, and while fasting and general mortification and penance is our defense against the flesh, we need to now have a game plan against the world, which can seep into us and make us worldly. And I dare say there is greater harm in a worldly Catholic than a non-Catholic. There is no witness power when we look like the rest of society. An outsider looking in would see someone unaffected by the faith they profess and say it makes no difference at all. It neuters the power of the cross and the resurrection. If you've seen a theme here, I hope you can fill in the blanks. The first solution against Satan was prayer. The battle plan against the flesh was fasting. Prayer, fasting, almsgiving. That's one part of our battle plan, to make sure we do not get influenced by the world. Because what the world offers is, yes, comfort, pleasure, but it also provides power and riches. This can get to us. Being at a high school, I am clear in knowing that peer pressure abounds. It is in the air they breathe, in the hallways. It's constant awareness of what the person at the next locker is doing, what they're wearing, what they're saying, what they're doing on the weekends. And what I realized as a priest is that's not just high school. It persists. And the only thing that can remedy it is this effort of detachment, and it begins with our financial resources. If we believe that what the world offers, which is wealth and comfort, will make us satisfied, then we are with the world, and we've lost the battle. If we are convinced that we have a wounded heart, like we established last night, original sin has done its work on our hearts, and it needs fixing. Because we're wounded by original sin, it is nearly inevitable that if we're not careful, our possessions will possess us. And many of us are not careful. A couple of examples of this. I mentioned that book last night, A Severe Mercy. In that book, the two newlyweds, Davy and Van, buy their first car together. And it's a classic car even in their day. It's an MG two-seater. And they are so protective of the love between them. And this is even before they convert to Christianity. The first thing they do when they drive it home, they grab a hammer and they beat the side of it once. I'm not proposing that tonight in the parking lot. I am not providing hammers. It might sound extreme. It's their choice. But that's how much they value their love for one another. If any part of their heart got attached to that car, that was one part of their heart they couldn't give each other. And we need to look at that as our possessions, our property, our house, our clothes, all of that in that same light. Another story, I've mentioned him many times, and I'll do it more tonight. St. Jose Maria Escrivá. There's a story of he had a brother who was born much younger than he, and he took great care of him. He was almost a fatherly figure. His younger brother Santiago, as a young boy, loved these lollipops that an old man used to sell at the street corner. And one day, he decided he was going to take his brother out to get a lollipop from the old man on the street corner, and there's a big gust of wind, and it blew up a big cloud of dust. And they both looked at the old man, and he sees the lollipops are covered with dust, and he begins to lick them one by one. They never wanted a lollipop ever again. And St. Jose Maria did not let that experience go unwasted. He saw that as a perfect image for how we are attracted to the things of this world. They seem so good. They seem so attractive, and everybody else on the street corner is getting them. We cannot get disillusioned. They will always disappoint in the end when you look past the surface. So when we talk about almsgiving and detachment, and we talk about our possessions as a source of making us worldly, we need to take a good, long, hard look not only at our tithing and our donations to charity, making sure it's not just for tax purposes, it's actually because, well, this is not my money after all. I might have earned it through work, but anything I receive is from God, and I need to give it back to Him and to serve Him with it. But even in our possessions, this is not making me saintly at all, but I've resolved that every year on my ordination anniversary, I'm going to go through my closets. And yes, I'm wearing clerics and cassocks 90% of the time, but free t-shirts from the youth group and campus ministry kind of pile up. I'm going to clear the closet just in case I accumulate too much possessions. I just can't. I need to be free to serve the Lord. And I've realized even stupid t-shirts I like, I keep. And I only give away the ones that I don't ever wear. Is that really an act of detachment? Not at all. I wasn't attached to those shirts to begin with. Who am I fooling myself to say I'm detached? You only detach when you can give something away that you are attached to. Something you wear, something you like or even value, just to make sure your heart can do it. Because at our judgment day, our Lord will say, do you choose me over this? And I have hopefully lived my life practicing it, saying no to the things of this world, not becoming worldly and saying yes to Christ over and over again. There have been multiple responses, especially to that more discussed book, The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher, over the last year. There are articles written. There's even a book called The Mary Option, as a counterpoint to the Benedict Option. I have not read it. I've heard reviews. Maybe worth your time. But an article that caught my eye, of course, because I'm a big fan of his, St. Jose Maria Escrivá, it's the Escrivá Option. Whether this catches the world by storm, I don't know, but I think it's worth it because it helps reconcile the various options presented in the books I mentioned tonight. In his lifetime, he was undoubtedly called to fill a void in the church about supporting and shedding light on the idea of the lay person living holiness in their everyday lives. And there was a moment in his life where he was offering the Mass, and he was holding the host aloft during the consecration. And in a divine inspiration, he heard it as clear as day. He heard the words, "I will draw all things to myself." And not just thinking with regards to the Eucharist and people, he even saw the work being done at factories and mothers at home doing their laundry. He saw all ordinary work being drawn to himself. And I think this is a little insight into ensuring that we never become worldly and we keep our witness power as Catholics, that nothing can be purely worldly in our lives. Everything must be sanctified. Our work, what we do, we might think is just to earn a living. Can I approach my work in such a way that it is a pleasing offering to God? If I can look at my desk as an altar and the work I do is a pleasing sacrifice to Him, then it is no longer secular. It is no longer worldly work just for a paycheck. It is now my pleasing offering to God. I have sanctified it. Almost like King Midas in that myth of touching everything that turns to gold. I've turned that into spiritual gold. Putting on my clothes in the morning. Is it just a routine that I go through? Or could I even say a prayer about, Lord, place upon me a garment of holiness? I've sanctified that moment. It's not secular or neutral anymore. It's spiritually powerful. And anything in your life that cannot be sanctified is not worth your time. That's how we ensure we're not worldly. As Archbishop Chaput said, we have no time for despair because we have good reason for hope, and Christ has commanded us to go and make disciples, to have witness power. And He's given us the grace and the means to live that witness, not of the world, but still in it. Since this is the final night, I want to conclude with just a couple final thoughts. It seems like the last 3 nights we focused on the enemies, Satan, our fallen flesh, our fallen world. But has it been? Christ and prayer with Christ is the answer. He is the one we cling to. Our fallen flesh, didn't we say He has come and taken on human flesh to remedy the wound? Tonight, the reason why we want to be detached from the world is to win the world for Christ, because He said He has conquered the world. And He has said He will draw all things to Himself. We just want to be collaborators with Him. I pray in this Lenten mission, this 40 hours devotion, He has been our focus. While we know our enemies, we're not closer to them. We're closer to Him. And insofar as we cling to Him, we will not lose. Another thought, because it's prominent in my work at the high school there north of Indianapolis. We all are called to witness to the world against Satan, his minions, our weak flesh and the temptations that come with it, and the world and all of its lure and temptation. But there are some who are consecrated precisely for that witness. And we, the laity, even secular priests, don't have the power like they do. And it's consecrated religious. Their 3 vows, the evangelical counsels, poverty, chastity, and obedience. Do you now see why they take those 3 vows? It's in direct contradiction to our 3 enemies. Their obedience fights against the pride which made Satan fall and made Adam fall. Their chastity fights against the flesh. And their poverty, they reject the world's offers because it can never match the riches of Christ. And so, There are young people here I ask you to discern, see what God's up to. But for the rest of you who have found your vocation, never cease praying, not just for priests. They have their role, and I'll speak to them in a second. But pray for especially consecrated women and consecrated men who will be, by their very existence, witnesses to a broken world. We priests, I ask you to pray for us too. The old phrase that we heard in the seminary is that the devil dances on the roof of the seminary. He goes after the pure of heart. He goes after the ones who can do most harm against him. There's an old Russian proverb that says, anytime the Lord builds a church, the devil pitches the tent across the street. And so I ask you to pray for your priests. St. Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, had a great devotion in praying for priests because her first time out of the country of France, she took a trip to Rome, where she actually begged the Holy Father to let her enter into a cloistered Carmelite community before the age. But it was on that trip was the first time she saw priests behind the scenes, if you will, and she wasn't flattered. So the rest of her life she prayed for priests. So I ask that of you tonight, that they might sanctify everything they do, that they might do their work, that we might do our work, defend against Satan, that we might battle the flesh, and that we might fight against the lures of the world, that we might not accumulate possessions or riches or honors what the world offers, that you and we might only find in Christ our true treasure, our true riches.